Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Next Steps. Alright, now that's a lot of information in this course. The VCAP exam is a pretty good sized exam. There's a lot of information there. At times it can almost feel overwhelming, and I think there's some ways to kind of get around that. So a couple of things. First of all, I've talked about the blueprint a number of times throughout this course, and I'm going to talk about it again. But I've taken this exam. I know many others that have taken it. And one thing we all agreed on was we thought it fit and matched the blueprint very well. I've taken exams in the past where I've read the blueprint, gone and taken the exam, and they asked stuff that was not even touched on in the blueprint or relevant to the information in it. But I don't think that's a problem with this course. So go through the blueprint and make sure you've covered all areas. I have tried point by point through the blueprint to hit every one of those through this course. If there's anywhere you feel like it's light or I missed, please let me know. I'm all about feedback, but I think we've hit every point, and I want to make sure you go through that and do the same. Make sure to look at the latest version. The blueprint does get it revised at times, so always make sure you look at the latest version on VMware's site. And one thing that I like is Chris Wall. Chris Wall is a friend of mine, and he's a great guy, really good blogger, a lot of real good information. And one thing that he has on his blog is a study sheet for the VCAP 5 DCA. It's basically the blueprint broken down, itemized out, and with a checklist. So he's got it so you can say, okay, I've read about this, and I've done this in my lab. And you can go check and make sure you've done those things. And I think that's a great idea. In fact, when I was doing this course, I built my own spreadsheet similar to what he did, and just checked things off as I went through and reviewed them in the material. So I think that's a great way to do it. That way you're not going to be surprised, you're not going to accidentally skip something. And I also think it's a great way to force yourself to do something. You may think, oh man, I know how to do auto deploy, I've done that a few times. Well, that's great, but I think you still need to read through it, check that box, do it in your lab, check that box. So again, I think that's a great thing, and his study sheet is real useful. Other study resources, there's a bunch of them. So there's a big list of them. These guys have done a great job. You know, some are groups, but others I know, Josh Cohen I know, Greg Robertson I know, Langer I know. A lot of these guys have put real time into this. So what they did was, as they studied for this course and would go through the blueprint and the objectives, they would take their notes and throw them on their blog. What I like about it is it's a great way to kind of get a different view of what they saw. And by that, I mean, you know, they look at things from a little different angle. Sometimes the objectives for this exam are wide-ranging, so the way I cover it, they may cover it differently. They may, you know, the things I talk about during the Power CLI lesson, they may talk about other commandlets, so it's a good idea to get a different view. I'm not going to tell you to go through all, 7 of these and read them, you know, end to end. But if you feel like you're light in an area, you may want to pick 1 or 2 of these, kind of go through and see what those guys had to say. And I found that pretty helpful. I mean, honestly, I found it helpful when I was studying for this exam to kind of fill in a couple of gaps. So just wanted to give you those as well. Some other recommendations, you know, this is a lab exam. If you can lab it, lab it. It'll make you faster, and it confirms you know what you're doing. Time is the key in this exam. So I hate for you to be doing something for the first time if you get a question on it. If you've, you know, never done something, it can take time to hunt through it. I mean, I had some experiences like that on a 1 question or 2 questions where it had been a long time since I had done something. It definitely slowed me down and contributed to the lack of time that I had. So again, the more you can do, obviously, the better. If you don't have a home lab, and I talked about these, I think in the first lesson, you know, there's AutoLab for Lab in a Box. It is a great tool. And then there's Bare Metal Cloud, which is a new offering that allows you to do it. So it's kind of like a lab in the, you know, a cloud-based lab. You can pay for it for a month, study for the exam, and you're done. So it's definitely gotten easier to prepare for these things. I've also hit on this a number of times, but I'm going to hit on it again. Make sure to confirm your VCP knowledge. What I mean by that is make sure you can move around the VI client quickly. Make sure you can do basic things like vMotioning VMs, storage vMotioning VMs, edit settings, look at advanced options, create your base clusters, create resource groups. You know, edit those things, know how they function, know what they're for, and understand that. We didn't have time in this course to go backtrack over all that knowledge. Train Signal has a great vSphere 5 course if there's anything that you're light on and want to review. But make sure you know how to do that stuff. Make sure you're quick. Make sure you know how to look up information. If I tell you to go find, all the 8 gig VMs, or how much memory this guy's got, or who's using the most space on data store X, make sure you know a quick and easy way to get that kind of information. Many things in this course and on the exam build upon that knowledge, and you're just going to be quicker as you go through that. Know the vSphere documentation set. Go grab it, download it, know the different books in the vSphere documentation, at least have an idea about it. If you're not going to memorize every CLI command and every option, which I don't recommend you do, honestly, if you're not going to do that, at least know where to look them up and what books they're in. So that way you can get to it quickly. You do have those in PDF during the exam. You can search through them, but it's best if you're not, hitting next, because you're looking for some information on an ESX CLI command. But useful, and during the exam, absolutely take full advantage of it. I had to look 1 or 2 options up when I was doing my exam. I don't blame you for doing that. And then look at the exam simulator. I think this isn't actually the last version, but all the interface is still the same for the current version of the exam. It'll just make it so that you know what it looks like when you get there. I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't look at it before I took the exam. It took me all of 2 minutes or less to figure out all the setup in the lab environment. But take a look at that just so you're comfortable in understanding, and you'll start to figure out why I tell you to do some things about switching back and forth between questions, looking at your different windows, and just trying to keep information straight. Scheduling exam. If you've never scheduled a VCAP type exam, it's different. So when you go schedule your VCP, or I go schedule one of the 58 Cisco exams that I have to take for partner programs for Vero, I go into View, I log in with my stuff, I pick my exam, and I schedule it. This one is not that simple. First, it must be approved by VMware. You have to ask to take this. So you have to request authorization on the VMware website. Basically, they want to make sure you've already a VCP and all that. And that's because there are limited slots for this exam. It is a lab exam. It's running on gear at VMware somewhere. So there's only so many slots. They can't have 1,000 people take this at one time like you can a lot of View exams. And that request can take a little while. I think it took me 3 or 4 days to get mine back. So, factor that in. And then it's also hard to get an actual exam date. These things are not given at all the regular View centers. They are only given at what are called the View Professional Centers. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. We have 2 of them here in Charlotte. The next one is a good bit away from me. So I'm used to being able to get an exam at one of the many View centers in Charlotte within a day or two's notice. But with these, I had to plan out about 8 or 9 business days before I could get a slot. So there's far fewer centers. This is a 4-hour exam, and so it's just tougher to get a spot in. They're also stricter on the rules there. What I mean by that is, normally when you walk in, take an exam, you give them your ID. They may take a picture of you depending on which exam, and then you're ready to go. At these, man, they make you lock everything you have up in a locker. You have to show ID. Then when you get to the, there's usually a few people. There's somebody at the front desk. There's somebody who will seat you. Every time you go somewhere, you have to have your ID, your picture ID with you. There's no drinks or food or anything allowed, and I'm a coffee fanatic. Anybody who knows me, I'm sitting here recording this right now with a latte I just made downstairs sitting in front of me, and I need my coffee, even if it's, I don't need the caffeine, I just have to have it with me. Nothing like that. So it's a 3.5-hour exam, plus if you're doing, a different language other than English, you get another little bit of time. So it's a long time. And you can get up and you can go to the restroom or take a break or whatever, but time is a big deal on this exam, so make sure that it's worth it and make sure you're really moving along. So it's just a bit more. So if you've never taken one at this professional centers, get there a little earlier than you normally do and be prepared for a bit more process, I guess. Taking the exam, I just mentioned, is 3.5 hours or longer if it's not in English, and all questions are lab based. We've talked about this, or at least hit on it a number of times. There's no multiple choice. Back when I was working on my VCDX, I took what was called the original Enterprise Admin exam. That was for vSphere 3.5, I think. And that one had some multiple choice questions, and then I think it was 11 lab exams, which were not nearly as complex as these. But that's not the case here. It is 26 straight-on labs. They just throw you to the wolves as soon as you start. So it's a very interesting exam. You have access to a small VMware environment. It's 2 servers, vCenter. You get access to PuTTY. If you haven't used PuTTY, do that. As well as the documentation set. So it's a pretty neat setup. I mean, they tell you not to touch some things. Like, they'll probably tell you not to touch the management ports on the ESX host, because if you accidentally disconnect one and can't recover it, there's nobody to call to fix that during your exam. So, make sure you don't do anything like that. And they do a good job of splitting that stuff off and kind of protecting you from yourself. But in the end, you're in a lab environment with some hosts, and you've got some tasks to do. Time, I've hit on this a lot, is your biggest enemy. Questions are often multiple tasks and not always simple. And sometimes the questions in the labs build upon previous labs. So you can't just skip ahead and do easy ones and then come back. Often you can't do the easy ones, or it's going to change what you do depending on what happened before. So keep an eye, and there's some things that may take time. I mean, if you have to move some VMs around data stores or do some big vMotions or something, vMotions are fairly quick, but if you've got to do something that takes time, look at the next question, say, okay, yeah, I can do this. It's not related to the last one, so while that's processing, go ahead and go to the next one. Just don't forget to go back and complete whatever you need to, so keep that in your head. But, work on that stuff, look at the tasks, see what you can multi-thread, see what you can do at the same time. Again, if it takes longer, looking ahead at the next task. And one thing I'll hit on here, since we're talking about time, is really sometimes the lab can get slow, and you got to everything's remote hosted. So I hope your view center has a good bandwidth and latency's fine and all that. But I noticed that as you do more things in the lab, it got a little slower and a little slower. And I've seen a few of the people who blog their experiences on labs say the same thing. So you keep that in mind, and as you move back and forth between the questions and the lab, that's a little bit of latency. You start noticing the system churning or swapping. As you move between windows, it can get hard, because I usually keep PuTTY windows open to each of my hosts. I keep RDP windows open to the vCenter and maybe some of the other Windows VMs in the lab. So all of a sudden you got a bunch of windows open, you got a bunch of stuff going on, and it can get slow. Don't let that frustrate you. Just keep that in mind, that as you go along, you may start taking a little longer and a little longer to do something. And also remember, it's not as much about how as the finished product. So, it doesn't matter if you have to storage vMotion a VM and you do it through the VI client, or you do it through a command line. Nobody cares as long as the task gets done. Just like if you're doing a job, and nobody cares which tool you use as long as the end product is the same. So, find the quickest way to do something. Maybe it's a command line because that's just what you're comfortable with. Don't worry about that if your buddy does everything through the UI. Just do it as quick as possible. But if for some reason you can't remember how to do something one way, see if you can get another way to do it. So again, there's multiple ways to do a lot of this stuff. You can't remember one, try to use another, and at least get to the end goal. And one other thing that I hadn't put on here is these questions. I believe it's actually spelled out in the exam description and part of the blueprint, is these are multitasked labs in a lot of cases. So it's not a simple 1 out of 26 I got number 2 right or I got it wrong. You may get 3/4 of it right and 1/4 of it not know how to do something. So don't look at this and go, oh man, it's auto deploy or something, and I don't remember how to do the power CLI commands for that. Well, I'll just skip this question. Do as much as you can, because you're going to get partial credit on a lot of this. So do as much of a question as you can and then move on. Or do pieces and parts of a lab, but if you don't know how to do the 4th part, that's fine, but do as much as you can so you get credit for that. So then what? So you go through, you sit down, you go through all this, you go without your coffee for 4 hours, you finish the lab, and you hit finished, and you're used to seeing like a green bar saying you passed, and you don't. And you won't. Because this is a lab exam. It is human graded. It is not, at least I don't think it's machine graded, but I'm pretty sure if somebody looks at it, and that takes time. So it's going to tell you that can take up to 15 days. I've known people that it's been 20 or 25 days. It personally took me 12 business days. I took it on, I believe it was a Friday, and then it was 2 full weeks, and I got my scores back on a Wednesday. And basically you're going to get an email, a happy email or a sad email, and you'll get your score out of a total of 500, and you'll see how you did, and passing score is 300. Cross your fingers and wait. If you passed it, you're not allowed to retake the exam. Just their way to keep people from, I guess, creating brain dumps and that. If you fail it, I believe it, and you can check this, but I believe it's still 2 weeks before you're allowed to retake it. But since it takes 10 to 15 days to get your score, you can basically retake it as soon as you get your score. I believe it's 10 days from the time you took it, not the time you got your score. So, look at it. I honestly don't know what the failure report looks like, if they tell you what areas you did well or not in. I know my success report didn't say anything like that. It said, congratulations, here's your score, blah, 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 and that was basically it. So what do you do after that? You get your pass, you're all happy, you're like, man, that guy Jason, that course was great, Train Signal's awesome. And then you're like, well, what do I do next, right? That just depends on what you want to do. Often people do the DCD. It's a next step. So that is the design exam, data center design. This is a weird exam because everybody asks me how you study for this exam, and I tell them you don't. So I had to take this exam to update my VCDX to 5 and also back in for 4. And it's an odd exam, and I do VMware design all the time. But, I kind of give VMware the benefit of the doubt on this one, that it is tough to write a standardized test for designing data centers in VMware and things like that. But this is often the next step, and it's an interesting exam. And my good buddy Scott Lowe has a great course here again on Train Signal to kind of help you with that. So even if you don't plan to do the DCD, but you do a lot of VMware work, or maybe you're a consultant or want to be into consulting, I suggest you go check that course out. I mean, Scott's great. There's really no better person in the industry to do that, and he did a phenomenal job. And then if you do the DCD and you pass, if you don't pass the DCD, don't stress it too hard. I know a lot of really great people that didn't the first time because, again, it's an odd exam, but let's say you do. And then the next step is really the VCDX. So this is a completely different animal. This is, you submit a very large VMware environment design to some people at VMware. They review it, and if they say, yeah, this is pretty good, we think you can defend this and pass, they'll approve you to do what's called the panel defense. And that's where you stand in front of 3 other VCDXs from VMware, and you present your design, which they've already read, but you present your design, and then they start pinging you questions on it. Why'd you do this? What did that affect? What do you think will occur here? Why didn't you just do this? What's that about? And there's a lot of back and forth, and it's basically to show that you're thinking on your feet, you did this design yourself, you can understand the ramifications of why things happened, you understand the dependencies, you understand the requirements, and it's really less of a technical certification than it is, again, a design certification, and being able to listen to customers, understanding their requirements, their constraints, their requirements, and just, being able to put those things together and come up with a valid design. So there's not many of those. I think as of the time I'm doing this, there's 110 or less. I'm number 49. I did mine back at VMworld a couple years ago, but it's a really great certification. It's something that not a lot of people have. But the real work from that certification is your documented design. I know my design was about 225 pages of documentation and diagrams and information, and that's what takes the time. But it's a great thing to do. And VMware now also has a lot of other certifications. They've kind of going down the desktop side, the cloud side with vCloud Director, and some other things. So it's not just the VCP single path anymore. There's a lot of other options. So obviously I wish you the best of luck, and I'm a big person when it comes to feedback. Good, bad, indifferent, exam experiences, you passed, you didn't pass, tips, tricks, whatever. I love to hear from people. So if you have questions, you have feedback, you feel like I could have covered something better, or I did a really great job, or it's missing something, shoot me an email, jason.nash@gmail.com. You can always find me on Twitter at @thejasonnash. There's a pretty funny story behind why I have that name. The other Jason Nash won't give his up. And my blog at www.jasonnash.com. But again, thank you from everyone at Train Signal, and good luck on your exam.